Welcome to the lightning lecture for tvOS for Xamarin. We're going to briefly examine how to use the new tvOS features with Xamarin Studio. So in this lightning lecture, we'll look at what is tvOS. We'll look at the kinds of things that you need to set up in order to develop against it. And we'll look at how we can code against tvOS, as well as looking at subtle differences between iOS and tvOS. We'll also see how we can use view controllers within our applications. And these are the same view controllers that we use in iOS. And we'll also look at how you can create applications and work with frameworks. We'll also look at how we can use the remote control and also see how we can deploy too. So what is tvOS? tvOS is the operating system for the Apple TV. And because it's written by Apple and it's based on the same iOS APIs that you're already used to, you'll find yourself very familiar with this technology, especially if you've already developed iOS applications. So there are several things that you'll need in order to truly develop for tvOS. And the first thing you need is to download the latest version of Xcode. And chances are you actually already have the latest version of Xcode on your system as a result of the automatic update feature. And if you haven't, then you'll need to make sure you download from the Mac App Store. Now you'll also need to make sure that you've got one of the previews of Xamarin.iOS. And that's one of the previews that includes support for tvOS. And just keep in mind for today's lightning lecture that this was made with the second preview of tvOS. So it might be that you're watching this video a little bit later and you've got some official support in the tool as well. And you also need an Apple TV or an Apple TV developer kit in order to test your applications. So just like dealing with mobile devices, you're really only going to get a true sense of how your application will perform and run on the platform by running it on real hardware. So even though there are simulators for tvOS, devices like the remote really require direct involvement to see the kind of effects and functionality that you'll use. In addition to this, you'll also need to make sure that you've got a USB-C cable. And this is so you can connect your Mac to the Apple TV. And USB-C replaces the Thunderbolt cable in connecting to your actual device to deploy applications. And if you're writing a game for the Apple TV, you should probably get a joystick as well that supports Apple TV. But keep in mind that if you're writing an app that uses a joystick, part of the guidelines for tvOS apps is that they need to work standalone with a remote as well. So let's look at what we need to do in order to code against tvOS. Fundamentally, tvOS is the same operating system as iOS. In fact, it's based on iOS 9, so a lot of the APIs that you're already familiar with are still available to you. In fact, the classes that you're familiar with the most, such as things like UI view controllers, UI views, and plenty of other APIs are available. So many of the frameworks that you're already used to are still available through tvOS. And there's plenty of frameworks that are there. In fact, you'll find many of them available like AV Foundation, UI Kit, Core Data, Core Location Game Kit, and many others. You'll also find two new additions into the mix, tvML Kit and TV Services. And tvML Kit allows you to integrate JavaScript and tvML files into your project to create the interface for your applications. But as we have the UI Kit framework, like UI view controllers, you'll probably unlikely use this as you'll be coding against UI view controllers. And TV Services is the other framework. And the TV Services allows us to define content from your applications, such as video files, to tvOS. So while we have some frameworks that we can use, there's also plenty of frameworks that are not available to us on tvOS. And these frameworks either just don't make sense for a TV, but at this point in time, they're just not available to you. So that includes Contacts, Address Book, Health Kit, Event Kit, and many more. And we'll find that there's a few things that are different when developing against tvOS. For example, when designing view controllers, you need to open up the storyboard designer in Xcode. Right now, there is no support for editing the storyboards in tvOS with Xamarin Studio. But using the designer is straightforward, and once you've designed the storyboard and created the actions and outlets, then you can write your code in C# the same way you always have. A little bit later in the Lightning lecture, we'll look at how we can do that with Xcode. And while you'll find that the view controllers are very similar to what we're used to with iOS, you'll find that the controls have a different way of presenting and focusing. And when you're entering data such as a UI text field, you'll often go to a new screen to enter the data and then come back. And this is a result of using the remote control as an input mechanism. You'll also find that you don't have access to WebKit, which means you no longer have access to UI WebView as well. So if you're expecting to embed HTML content in one of your view controllers, unfortunately you won't be able to do that on tvOS. Writing code to work with the tvOS remote control is actually really straightforward. The chances are you already know the basic mechanism behind it because it's the same gesture recognizer support that you would already write in an iOS application. And you'll find that the remote control will listen for various gestures. It'll listen for swipe gestures while you navigate left, right, up and down. It'll also listen for tap gestures and also listen for long press gestures too. So it's very easy to add that functionality. And on the slide you can see examples of the code used to add remote control support, which is essentially identical to what you might do in iOS. Now, in addition to the normal gesture recognizers, there's also additional buttons on the tvOS remote control that you need to account for. For example, if you wanted to detect a tap on one of the other buttons, such as the play button, you'd need to set the allowed press types to an appropriate enumeration, such as UI press type.play pause or UI press type.menu. You can see an example of this on the slide where we're looking for the tap only on the play pause button. There's also another property on the tap gesture recognizer used here, and that's the allowed touch types, which you can set to either a direct or an indirect touch. So a direct touch is a click on the trackpad surface, where an indirect touch is really just a light tap on the trackpad. tvOS also has additional changes around storage. In fact, the storage of application settings, such as key values and documents, need to be stored to iCloud, as the platform doesn't allow local storage on the device. And this is a change from iOS, where you could easily use the file system in the application sandbox. And the application sizes are also limited to a maximum size of 200 meg, although additional content can be downloaded through a mechanism known as on-demand resources, which is done after the app is installed but while the app is in use. So while you can store information, it is only stored against the device's cache, and it might be cleared out to make space for other content, so you can't really rely on it always being there. Now, icons are also something very different for tvOS, and while we've been dealing with Retina images in the mobile space for many years, all the images for tvOS are just the single standard size. Now, like other mobile apps, it's actually best to use asset catalogs to manage your images when you're dealing with graphics. But there's also an awesome new feature in tvOS when dealing with icons, and that's something called layered icons. Layered icons are really just a series of images that are presented on multiple layers to create a parallax effect on the icon on the TVs. And constructing these layered icons is done either using the Parallax Preview tool or a particular Photoshop filter available from Apple. And these create the images from the layers, and both the Parallax Preview and the Photoshop filter are available from the Apple Developer Download page, and you can find a link to the tools at the bottom of the slide. So let's take a quick look at creating a layered icon. So let's have a look at how to create a layered icon using the Parallax Preview tool. So I'm going to open this up. I've already installed this to my local system, and it's a pretty straightforward tool. You really are creating a single image which is composed in multiple layers through a series of other images. So what we need to do is we need to add a series of icons. I've already got a few here. This is for one of my tvOS games that I'm working on, which is really a nice little Minesweeper clone. I'll select all the images that are going to become part of that layered icon and then just open that directly. So here I've got my background that looks like it's in the wrong order. That needs to go right to the bottom, so I'll just drag that to the new order. And I've got some other icons too, and you'll notice as I move the mouse around, you can see the layered effect. So I can certainly move some of these icons a little bit further to create the depth effect that I'm after. And what you'll find is when the remote controller is hovering over a particular app, as it's scrolling using the remote control trackpad, it'll actually create this style of visual effect. Also, you'll get a slight visual effect as it navigates to the left or right, just to show the parallax effect. Now, if you've already deployed an app to the iOS App Store, then you're probably already familiar with the techniques that you would need in order to deploy a tvOS app. And when you're creating a provisioning profile for your application, whether it's for debugging purposes or for deploying, you'd actually just select the tvOS development or the tvOS deployment provisioning profile. Now let's have a look at creating a tvOS app using view controllers. And we'll also take a look at how to use a tvOS remote control using the emulator, just for your local debugging purposes. Okay, so what we'll do now is we'll go ahead and create a very simple storyboard-based app for tvOS. So we're in Xamarin Studio. I'm just going to select New Solution. And from my list of templates, I'm going to select the tvOS. And I'll just go ahead and select a single view app. I'll give it an app name. And then I'll place it in an appropriate folder. For me, I'll just put it on my desktop today. And then that'll go ahead and create the appropriate template for me. And you'll see the code looks very similar to what you might get if you're doing an iOS app. In fact, it's still using Foundation and UIKit. So if we want to affect the change on the storyboard, we can see we do have a storyboard here. If we double click it, we'll actually see that there's a different kind of structure that we can see. We can see the file format is not supported, and we actually need to open that in Xcode. So we'll click on this button, and then it'll open up Xcode, and we'll be able to start editing that particular storyboard in just a second. All right, so here's our view controller scene. We might just resize this window for a second. And if we just scroll up, you can actually see that view controller. And on the right-hand side here, we can see a list of objects. So this is like our toolbox. So we might just scroll down a little bit, select a label. So we'll drag that onto the surface. I might drag some other controls on there as well, a text field and another button and another label. Awesome. So once I've got these properties selected, I can change some attributes about those as well. I can see the particular details. I might select the options for it. I might give it some other details here. Enter your name. And I probably want to change the font here too. So I'm going to make this larger. I might change that to 40. Just reposition a few things there, change the alignment. And then I'm also going to change the constraints for this. So I might just lock that to the top and the bottom just to add some simple positioning. And I've also got my text field here. I want to resize that. There I've got my name. And that's pretty good. I'll add some constraints there. And likewise for the button, I'll change the text to say hello. Add some constraints there. Just change that text to something like hello, just from a space requirement. And this label underneath I'll just add a little bit of a message. I'll change the font here too.
resize it, reposition it, center it, and then add those constraints. In fact, if I save this, I can certainly go back to Xamarin Studio, and I can actually launch that in the emulator, and that will show in the main window. Here's the Apple TV emulator running, and there's our user interface. Now, one of the things you'll find about the user interface controls for Apple TV is you will actually need to select the Show Apple TV remote. So let's do that. And it's got a kind of an interesting way of working. I can certainly click on that and it'll take me to the entry, and I can use the Apple TV remote. It's a very subtle way of controlling it. You need to hold the Option key down and then slide in a particular direction. And when you get to that end direction, lift the Option key up. Otherwise, you end up going backwards. So we might just put some other entries in and then scroll down to mark it as done. And then it'll go back to the previous screen. So we can scroll down there and then we can click the Hello button. So a pretty simple interface, but we do need to get access to those controls for our user interface too. So this is where we go back into Xcode and actually update some of these controls. So I'll just reposition this for a second. You can see we've got the simple app on the left-hand side. We've also got our view controller, and it's got some definitions in there. And what we want to do is we want to get that particular screen from the storyboard, and we want to get the controls that we want to manipulate, and then actually drag them into the view controller. So we'll drag that in there, and we want to create an outlet. So we want to have a name really for that UI text field, and I'll just call this my name. Connect that in, and I'm going to do the same thing with the button. So I'll drag that into the window, create another outlet for the button. But in the button's case, I'm actually not going to create an outlet. I'm going to go back again, and I'm going to create an action. So the action in this case will be a response. So we'll call this Say Hello Click, and we'll connect that in. And then lastly, we have this label down the bottom. We'll add the outlet in for that one, and we'll call Who to Say Hello To. And we'll connect that in. And at that point, we can save our changes, head back to Xamarin Studio, just stop the code there for a second. And if we look at the View Controller Designer, we can see we've got a few outlets. We've got my name, who to say hello to, and then we've got an action for the Say Hello click. And right now, all we have to do is add the code that connects it all together. So in our View Controller, we'll implement the partial method, Say Hello Click. And at this point, we want to use those properties. So we're going to use my name. So who to say hello to click. We'll set the text equal to hello. And then we'll take the name. Now we can go and run that application. And see it all working. So here on the simulator, click on the UI text field, we'll scroll. So I'll just go and put a name in here. Let's put John in this case. Hit done, scroll down to the hello button, click on hello, and there you see the message. So a nice simple way to create an application using the UI view controllers. So obviously that's a nice simple walkthrough of getting started working with tvOS, but there's lots of great content available to find out more about tvOS, and you can see some links here on the slide. And the Xamarin documentation site has a range of great new articles outlining the various features of tvOS and how to work with it. And this includes concepts such as data storage, icons, and other topics that we've just touched on today. In addition, you should also be referring to the Apple Developer Guidelines for tvOS. Just like when publishing an iOS application, for tvOS, you should be reading through the developer guidelines to make sure you're following the appropriate conventions. And this will help you maximize your chances of getting approved during the review process. So thanks everyone for watching this lightning lecture on working with tvOS. From here, I hope you'll take this knowledge and start building your own great tvOS apps. My name's Glenn Stevens, and I hope to see you in some more Xamarin University lightning lectures or Xamarin University classes. Until then.